Goblins. In all the history of tabletop role-playing games as a whole, and certainly Dungeons & Dragons, goblins are probably one of the most common early enemies that you will face. Despite the best efforts of Goblin Slayer, we still tend to think of goblins as low-level enemies, a joke, almost, rats with thumbs. They turn up everywhere, basic AD&D, 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, starter sets, intro boxes, classic modules, homebrew, fantasy heartbreakers, you name it. Designers lean on them because they're low-level friendly, still somewhat fantastical, narratively flexible. They can be raiders, minions, comic relief, tragic victims, whatever. And they're culturally iconic in fantasy gaming and fantasy media more broadly, particularly the foundational texts of Tolkien. Nobody feels that bad about murdering a band of evil midgets who love to rape, murder, and torture. There are other contenders for the most common low-level critters that you're likely to face. Rats is one of the most stereotypical ones. Skeletons, zombies, wolves, kobolds, bandits. But goblins are the virtually unimpeachable champions of early XP fodder. They're the Big Macs of D&D monsters. Always on the menu, always serviceable, rarely exciting, but guaranteed to show up in the first chapter of anything, usually as the servants of a dark greater power that isn't intelligent enough to hire someone competent and so settles on goblins. But where, oh where, does our concept of goblins come from? Goblins are basically a pan-European grab bag of small, troublesome, somewhat humanoid spirits. There isn't a single clean origin for what we think of as goblins today. They're a sort of Frankenstein's monster of various European influences, but a strong root is in English and Welsh folklore, where we find the closest match to the standard issue D&D goblin. Goblin, gobelin, and gobliny show up in medieval English text, referring to malicious and wicked household spirits, mine lurkers, and nocturnal pests. They overlap with other fae. They're presented as mischief makers, thieves, fire starters, or things that sat on your chest at night and ruined your sleep, like the classic sleep paralysis hag or the breath-stealing goblin from Cat's Eye that still gives me nightmares. In French folklore, the word gobelin shows up in 12th century Norman French, which is probably how it made its way to Britain. One of the earliest mentions is the Gobelin of Evreux, a troublesome house spirit blamed for noises, pranks, and general sort of gremlin-esque type nonsense. Of course, the Normans brought these ideas to Britain, as did the Danes and others in various other forms, and so this ended up informing British folklore, and therefore Tolkien's synthesis of the new goblin. In Germanic and Scandinavian locales, you'd get related creatures like kobolds, nisses, dwarves, and trolls, some of which were at least goblin adjacent, if not actually goblins. Across Europe, there is a slew of broadly similar beings: redcaps, imps, trolls, Hausgeister, domovoi, and more. Goblins in modern fantasy are basically a distillation of these annoying small humanoid spirit archetypes whose witchcraft and magic has slowly been replaced with a different kind of cunning, or kenning, a certain adroitness with technology, traps, and devices. Goblins, as we think of them, are essentially Western European in origin, particularly English, French, and Germanic, and the D&D version is a modern interpretation of that, drawn from Tolkien's fictional synthesis of these myths, rather than as a faithful sort of lift from any single mythology. But just about every culture on Earth has its own flavour of small, tricky, vaguely human thing that makes your life harder. They don't map perfectly onto the Western modern goblin, but the behavioural niche, petty, malicious, sabotaging, mischievous, nocturnal, uncanny little bastards is fairly universal. We all seem to need someone or something to blame when we can't find the lid to our pen, that stray sock, or the thing that I just put down right there, just now. Tolkien read the same folklore compendiums that you would have found in any Edwardian household, which brought together a lot of these stories and influences and ideas, and it was from these and his deeper research that it seems he formed the goblins that he first fully realised in The Hobbit. You see it in the language too. Goblin and hob are the older English terms, orc the Old English Beowulf poetic one. He often said the two referred to roughly the same creature, just from different angles and traditions, which is part of why we now talk even more broadly about goblinoids, with Games Workshop cementing a sort of hierarchy of different roles of these related creatures. There is, however, a missing link and an oft overlooked origin point for the modern conception of goblins. The Victorian fairy tale author George MacDonald basically created the template that Tolkien then went on to develop and riff on. Goblins living underground, being both cruel but also comical, kidnappers who lived underground and were prone to cruel slapstick, and so on. Tolkien, apparently, adored MacDonald's work. You read The Princess and the Goblin by MacDonald, and you're basically reading an early draft of The Hobbit's goblins with the serial numbers filed off.
There was a legend current in that part of the country that at one time they lived above ground and were very like other people. But for some reason or other, concerning which there were different legendary theories, the king had laid a curse upon them, and they had been driven into their holes. They were not very good looking. Their feet are particularly odd, for they have no toes, only toeless lumps of flesh where toes should be. They were a very hard-hearted race altogether, ready to think the worst of everybody else, and disposed to do the worst they could upon a very small provocation. Her face was not a pleasant one, though it might have been fairly good-looking, but for her compressed lips and cold green eyes. The goblins lived in the subterranean caverns, which had been hollowed out by themselves or by their forefathers. The grandest of their rooms were supported by pillars of living rock. Their voices were coarse and strange, and sounded to the children as if they were talking through water. The goblins were especially afraid of the sound of laughter, which they hated mortally. His head was too large for his body, but as the distinction went on in his race, the size of the head seemed to increase and the limbs to dwindle. His face was bloated and pale, with a nose like a cuttlefish and small, cruel, cunning eyes.
MacDonald's goblins are suspiciously human-like, but a sort of degenerate form of human, changed and twisted by bitterness and exile, but originally from human stock, altered by their life underground. Almost the Victorian urban poor seen through a nightmare lens, but that degeneration or that twisted mockery is something you would also see in Tolkien's work, less overtly classist, when he came to talking about orcs and goblins and so on. Tolkien read this, Lewis read this. D&D indirectly inherits quite a lot from this depiction of goblins. The cruelty, the cave dwelling, the slightly comic, slightly scary goblin is basically MacDonald's invention that was later then improved upon. Tolkien refused, often somewhat abruptly for a gentleman, that the ideas in his work were allegorical, but it's hard not to draw comparisons to the Great War in a lot of what he put in there, whether it's intentional or not. Tolkien's orcs and goblins pick up traits straight from the trenches of World War I. Charging massed hordes, the use of industry to fell purpose, cunning and terror, industrialized cruelty, though that's even more a feature of Saruman's orcs. Their crude brutality, the effect that war has on men, again this theme of twisting and manipulating and deforming what was otherwise there, in the same way that the orcs and goblins were twisted by the dark power of Morgoth, Sauron, and Saruman. He never admitted it cleanly. He hated allegory talk in the same way that Garth Marenghi hates subtext, but the imagery is straight from the Somme, and much of the negative propaganda about the Germans. If anyone should be worried about orcs being racist, it's probably the Krauts. Speaking of orcs, now they often get overplayed by purists, but yet Tolkien revived the Old English word orc from Beowulf. In the poem, Orcneas basically means demon corpses, which implies more the animated dead, or hellish creatures, which suggests more demons. Certainly demons of a sort, which is one of Tolkien's conflicting concepts for the orcish race. He welded that onto his goblins to create a nastier, more mythic, more monstrous version, what later would become the Uruk-hai and the broader orcish race in The Lord of the Rings. And they were definitely not comedic, though you still see a few nasty comedic touches in the way they interact with each other. This was him retrofitting his hobbit goblins back into his growing legendarium. Another important aspect that went into these creatures were the Norse dwarves. Not exactly goblins, but their culture of underground craftsman societies influenced his sense of how orcs might work as miners and tunnel dwellers and competition for the dwarves. So in a way, as well as being inverted elves, they're also inverted dwarves. He inverted the dwarf archetype and divided the two mythical species. The worst bits got pushed into the orcs, the best, most positive interpretations, mostly, got pushed into the dwarves. The goblins are creatures of the dark and the dank and the deep, of twisted industry, the wild and unnatural world of the deep caverns, perverted by their presence, while the dwarves were the flip side of orcish inhumanity, or in dwarfity? Craftsmen, prideful, who devoted their art to making things and creating beautiful, vaulted constructions of architecture deep in the ground. The goblins are creatures of the dark, dank, cold, wet, and deep. Dwarves, not so much. A warmer darkness. It is then Tolkien's goblins that set the mould for fantasy gaming. A combination of English goblinry, George MacDonald's fairy tales, the grim darkness of trench warfare, Beowulf's orcs, some Nordic structure, and his own imaginings. He took the local English idea, hammered it into a darker, more industrial shape, and retroactively tied it into his invented mythos. So how, the merry fuck, did these things, these monstrous creations, become green-skinned football hooligans elsewhere, and a patronising image of noble savages in some other interpretations? How they became green is a bit of a fun one, because it's not mythological at all, it's pop culture drift. Tolkien's orcs were not green. Tolkien never described orcs or goblins as being green-skinned. They were swarthy, sallow, greyish, mottled, black-blooded sometimes, but never bright green. In the 60s and 70s, fantasy art really began to take off. When fantasy illustrators needed to give a monster an unnatural look in colour prints, green really stood out, printed well, and contrasted with human flesh tones. When they colorized Frankenstein, for example, he was given a greenish hue. Grey tones could be hard to print consistently, especially on cheaper paper stock, meaning that quite often they had to stray from Tolkien's description in order to make an effective image. This is not that dissimilar to the story of why the Incredible Hulk is green. I couldn't get the grey to be consistent in the old printing. Some early artists painted goblins green just because. It did photograph well, photograph better than grey. It avoided racial undertones. Yes, people were being stupid about this even back then. And it made goblins into something that was definitely and definitively other than human. It just helped. Then along comes Dungeons and Dragons in the mid-1970s, hitting its first heyday in the early 1980s. D&D's earliest art was, shall we say, inconsistent. Goblins were variously brown, grey, orange, red, and very occasionally green. But by AD&D First Edition and Second Edition, the Monster Manual illustrations and modules, particularly from TSR's artists like Caldwell and Elmore, tended to push at least slightly more greenish tones into them. And by the time of the D&D cartoon, orcs, at least pig orcs, were very definitely green, fitting the cartoon solid colour aesthetic. But this was still not universal until Warhammer. And Warhammer is the big one. Games Workshop codified that goblins are green, the orcs are green, that black orcs from fantasy were darker green, and that hobgoblins were orange. What the fuck? You had a theme going there. And every edition hammered it home with cohesive colour art. Warhammer's massively popular art and playful football hooligan take on orcs, again, a little bit classist, leaked into D&D fan expectations. D&D 3rd edition onward embraced more green and yellow tones for goblins and orcs. And this is the real origin of this whole cultural cliche. Or not, if not its origin, its codification and calcification in the public consciousness. Now, the paternalistic noble savage thing came in later, and I think it is almost an inevitable natural outgrowth of the whole Hickman revolution and the shift in emphasis that it brought to gaming's Iron Age later on in the 90s. The Hickman revolution is a term used to describe the shift in Dungeons & Dragons design philosophy championed by Tracy Hickman, moving away from open-ended sandbox-style play or cheesy dungeons that didn't necessarily make any sense, towards more plot-driven, story-focused adventures where dungeons and so on were built with a purpose. This change was partly due to his 1982 Pharaoh module and its manifesto, which outlined a new design philosophy, player objectives beyond just pillage and kill everything, intricate stories woven into gameplay, architecturally sensible dungeons, and attainable, honourable ends within a few sessions. While immensely popular and influential on the role-playing hobby, this shift has also been criticised in some quarters for its tendency to lead to railroading and for GMs to become more frustrated novelists, or at least module publishers to become more frustrated novelists. And it did represent a move away from more lethal player-driven styles in earlier games. The emphasis on more nuanced and complex play, the shift in emphasis to imposed rather than emergent narrative, and the idea that games could be more mature and thoughtful led people to ask questions like, are all orcs evil? And should you kill baby goblins? Basic, sort of naive stuff in a way, but it does reveal a lot about game worlds and how we think about them, and the metaphysics that are present in them. Back then, this was a revolutionary take. It's hackneyed now. It is stereotypical now. It no longer has the same fun or intellectual stimulation that it had back then. But it was something that was worth exploring. The trouble is that now it has become this dominant tone, this dominant idea. And so now, in reaction to that, it's far more interesting to explore concepts of inherent evil. But back then, it was different and it was new. So then enter Warcraft. Now Warcraft bodged getting the Warhammer license, and so they made their own slightly more family-friendly version. They cemented the idea of the sympathetic noble orc in mainstream fantasy. Their orcs were misunderstood, heroic, muscular, and green. Their goblins were small, green, and tech-obsessed wretches. Millions experienced Warcraft before reading Tolkien, playing D&D, or playing Warhammer. And the long and the short of it is that this absolutely drove the greenness home and sealed our doom for noble savage orcs. D&D's drifted back away from the whole green thing in recent years to try and get a little bit more identity into their product. But the influence is very much still there.
Oh, Alison Gross, that lives in yon tower, the ugliest witch in the North Country, has trysted me day up till her bower, and many fair speech she made to me. She stroked my head and she caught my hair, and she set me down softly on her knee. Says, King, you will be my ain true love, say, well, you shall be paid by me. I answered no, I answered no, I answered no, but modestly, can I kinda be your ain true love, I trow you let me be. She gied me a mantle, oh the red scarlet, the gay green gown, oh the silk sae fine, and a silver wand to play with at the yet, and bade me be her ain true love. I answered no, I answered no, I answered no, but modestly, can I kinda be your ain true love, I trow you let me be. She gied me a shirt, oh the cleanest lace, and a coat, oh the gay green, and bade me keep it for the sake, oh her love say free. I answered no, I answered no, I answered no, but modestly, can I kinda be your ain true love, I trow you let me be. For I would not be her ain true love, she has turned me to a delight tree. But as it fell out last Halloween, and the Sealy court came a riding by, and they laid their hands upon that tree, and the tree did grow right lustily. They turned me to a green right tree, and then they bade it stand. The first that came was Lady Maisry, and she got me by the hand. The next that come was a Lady Maisry, and she got me by the hand. And the next that come was a Lady Maisry, and she took me by the hand. They turned me back into a man, and they made me hale and free. And the first that come was a Lady Maisry, and she's wedded me.
Which brings us around to an interesting point. D20 Modern had this idea of monsters hiding in the modern world, and I think that's an interesting thing to examine. Were goblins to exist in a modern setting and not to be genocided by angry humans, I think they would end up being urban scavengers, like raccoons crossed with feral children crossed with urban foxes, Victorian urchins and opportunistic gangsters. Modern cities would in many ways be perfect for goblins. They have warm vents, underground tunnels, endless rubbish, abandoned buildings, storm drains, scrapyards, hoarder houses, fast food bins, the manor of the gods, and more. Their small size, their dark vision, and the classic goblin cunning and inventiveness, they'd be everywhere, between the cracks. New York sewers, abandoned Detroit factories, London tube tunnels after hours. They'd be pests, but just human enough that we might feel guilty about exterminating them. They'd probably avoid humans for for the most part, but absolutely live off them. They live as gangs, clans and crews. Goblins wouldn't do tribes in an orcish sense, they'd do squabbling, opportunistic clusters centered around access to food, warmth, territory, petty theft, and charismatic psychopaths to act as their leaders. You'd expect goblin crews living behind supermarkets, goblin gangs in derelict tower blocks, goblin entrepreneurs running illegal recycling rings, goblin fixers trading scavenged electronics for favours, goblins acting as runners and lookouts for human and presumably other gangs. Their society, as such, would resemble feral youth gangs crossed with rats, plus a touch of Dickensian pickpockets here and there. They would thrive on all of the things that humans discard: copper wire, aluminium cans, tossed out takeaway, scrap electronics, clothing from charity bins, lost items in public transit tunnels. They'd excel at it, repurposing junk, crude engineering, opportunistic burglary, squeezing through gaps that nobody else would fit through. They'd become the invisible recyclers of the megacities. And when it comes to interaction with humans, a goblin isn't suicidal, it's cunning. Real-world interactions might include being a harmless nuisance, goddamn goblins got in the bins again, stolen shoes from porches, missing tyres, chewed cables, bins tipped over, strange noises coming from the walls, random graffiti that might be a territorial marker to other goblins, criminal enterprise, petty theft, illegal scrap trading, garden raiding, night shift employees swearing that there was something in the storeroom last night. They're not stupid. They develop strategies to stay out of sight, and if they retained magic, using a bit of that. Moving at night, avoiding open areas, treating humans like the apex predators they are, living in dead spaces that humans ignore, stealing only what might be missed, what won't be missed, or cared about, avoiding leaving bodies or obvious evidence. Why waste the meat? Filth and darkness are their friends because they keep us away, kinda like the racism on 4chan. They have strengths that would help them in the modern world. Dark vision gives them access to basements, sewers, subways, power tunnels and so on without needing a light source. Paradise for goblins, and you can see people with a light coming a mile off. Their scavenger metabolism means that they could live off mouldy bread, rotten meat, cat food, discarded kebabs, pets, pigeons, rats, and plenty of other things that would not be food to any of the rest of us. Goblins also likely have a hell of a reproduction rate, so given half a chance they would multiply like rats. They're also handy, if not with magic, with devices and technology, albeit a bit janky. A goblin with access to a busted electric scooter, a bag of nails, 10 meters of copper wire, and an old Nokia phone becomes a problem. Maybe we'd have catch and release programs where we neuter them, I don't know. They'd struggle with surveillance tech, environmental hazards like trains and electricity and traffic, exterminators, legal or not, territorial disputes within themselves, all of that kind of thing. A goblin society today would not be romantic or necessarily pitiable. It would be nasty and brutish and extremely mobile, and probably as horribly inbred as a feral cat colony. Once they adapt, they could probably do far better today than in any fantasy world. They'd form parallel micro-societies in the dark, they'd infiltrate our supply chains, raid postal trains for Amazon deliveries. They would influence the black market with the availability of all the stuff that they could get. They would steal and repurpose everything into Heath Robinson devices doing God knows what. They would treat discarded human technology as treasure. Probably there'd be a whole underworld ecosystem where they trade stuff that they've nicked at pawn shops and fences. They'd be the invisible ecosystem under every big city. And if they ever learned to cooperate, they'd become a genuine underworld civilization and the biggest disorganized crime syndicate. Food for thought. Zang. Sup bitches? I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff. So here I am, pimping my stuff in what's hopefully an amusing way. If you want to interact with me and follow me, you can find me on Twitter @Grimosaur and @Mort_post for official announcements.